Challenges we have sometimes as believers is to be willing to do and act and say what is right, even when it may not be the most popular thing to do. To behave in the manner in which God would have us to conduct ourselves in the way that is right in the eyes of God when the adversary's around. When we know it won't be popular, when we know that it might receive a negative response from those around us, and a willingness to not be afraid to do what's right. And so this morning I'd like to just talk for a little while about this concept or this thought of never being afraid of what is right and never being afraid of what God defines as the best path in various circumstances. When you look at that narrative that was just read for us a moment ago there in Philippians chapter 1, and in verse 27, I want you to notice again with me, verses 27 and 28 to kind of set the stage for our study this morning. But notice he said, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ." Let that sink in for a minute. How often would it be said of our conduct that it is worthy of the gospel of Christ? That it measures up to the standard by which is outlined for us in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that whether I come and see you or am absent, Paul says, whether I'm with you or whether I'm not, that your behavior and conduct never changes. That you always desire to do what would be honorable in relationship to the gospel, and that you would sustain that and maintain that. That I may hear of your affairs, and that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries. Never let the adversary win the day when it comes to living according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Never be afraid to do what is right. The minute the devil can convince you to have fear of doing what is right, he's won the battle. The minute the devil can convince you that you should pay attention to the fears and the being terrified and the fear of the consequences that might come because you're about to stand up for what is right, if he can get you or I to think that way, then he's won the battle. And he's got us doubting whether the right thing should be honored and whether I really should fall into the path of the gospel and as it would lead me. So he says, don't be terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God. Whatever the adversaries might say, whatever those around us might say in contrary to the gospel of Jesus, don't be afraid to honor it as we walk through this life. And so how do we put away the fear then? How do we put away the fear of these adversaries and the things that might distract me from doing what's right? And so let me share just a handful of things with you this morning that I think will strengthen us to overcome these fears and be able to put them away. And first, let's begin in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28. I think if we can understand where real fear belongs, then maybe we can have a better ability to overcome the things that might cause us some anxious moments as we stand for what is right and true. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus teaching here in this chapter, verse 28, notice the words of the Savior. He says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul." Now let me stop and get you to think about that for a minute. That's pretty powerful when you think about it, right? Because we are conditioned in some senses to fear what people might do to our bodies. We lock our doors at night. We lock our car doors. We do what we can to protect ourselves. We don't go into certain areas at certain times of night. We find ways to avoid certain circumstances, and we kind of know our limitations, and we do all kinds of things, right? To protect our physical bodies and any harm that might come to us. And yet Jesus challenges us to not put an inordinate fear over what might happen to our physical life in the sense that it becomes the primary even over our souls. Don't be afraid of the one who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, that's a hard moment. And I don't know whether any of us have ever really reached that pinnacle of challenge where we have to make a choice and a decision. Well, am I willing to sacrifice my physical life to maintain the honor of my soul and the integrity of my faith, that I might stand justified in the eyes of a God who can control both body and soul? It might not reach that level for us. It might not reach a point where I'm actually going to have to decide whether I'll die physically to maintain my integrity of faith. But may I suggest to you that there are lots of things that happen to us far, far less than that extreme, where we have to make decisions about soul or body. Do I take the ridicule in the moment? Do I take the scoffing in the moment? Do I withstand what others might say to me in the moment to maintain the integrity of faith that maintains my soul in the process? Jesus says real fear belongs to God. Real fear belongs in the thoughts of what God has power to do, not in what man can do to us. Notice what Paul said about this subject in Acts chapter 18 and in verse 9. Acts chapter 18 and verse 9. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. And Jesus says in this vision to him, "Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent." It's interesting that even in the midst of challenging circumstances, the presentation of the gospel, here Jesus seems to come very literally in relationship to Paul, and he says, listen, don't be afraid to speak. Don't be afraid to share the message of the gospel. Don't keep silence because of fear. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. Now, I recognize that he has a very specific circumstance that he's involved in a particular location, and there's a certain level of protection that God's offering to him because of that. But the principle still holds true. Jesus says, don't be afraid to speak. Don't be afraid to tell the truth, no matter what. Don't be afraid to speak that which is right. And I don't care how old or young we might be. I think we all experience anxious moments of where we know if we say what's right, we know consequences coming. If we speak truth in certain environments and in certain settings, and we have the courage to stand up for what is right, we know that there are going to be consequences to that. And yet sometimes we need to be emboldened and encouraged to recognize that we need to overcome those fears and not be afraid to speak that which is right in every circumstance that we might find ourselves in. Peter had an admonition over in 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 14. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 14, if you catch how I said that this morning. 1 Peter 3 and verse 14. He said, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake. Now just stop. Think about what he just said. Generally speaking, when we hear those kinds of statements, we want to kind of block it off, right? I don't want to hear anything about me having to suffer. I don't want to hear anything about me having some kind of consequence that might come. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. Quick question, do you believe that? Do you consider it a blessing when you suffer because of righteousness' sake? You see, that's the hard part. One of the challenges to overcoming the fears and the anxieties that we might have about doing right is to convince ourselves of this basic truth, that when we do righteousness, it is always blessed in the eyes of God. When we do that which is right, it is always a blessing in the eyes of God. To challenge ourselves to believe that is hard, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed, and do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. Don't fear the threats and the challenges and the things that people might say. Well, if you don't go along with us, then this is going to happen. Or if you don't lend your hand to us, then you're not going to be part of our group anymore. Or if you don't bend a little here, then you're not going to be accepted in this clique. And if you don't, it's not worth it. God says, for righteousness' sake, do whatever it takes to honor Jehovah. And let the consequences come. Because the blessings of God are far better than the threats and the difficulties and the anxieties that those around us may cause in our lives. Never be afraid of what is right. I think about those Israelites in Numbers chapter 13. They're a great example. We use them a lot sometimes. But they're a great example of how close people can get to great benefit and then let fear kick in and stop them from the ultimate goal. They've come to the very doorstep of the promised land. They've been through a lot. They've experienced a lot. God has guided them, led them, helped them, secured them, protected them. He's done everything He can to get them to this point. And He gives them some very basic requests, rules. Pick you out 12 men, one from each tribe, send them into the promised land, let them look it out, find where the walled cities are, find what kind of people inhabit the land, be of good courage and bring us back some of the fruit so the people can know what kind of place God is going to give them as this promised land. So the orders, if you will, are pretty clear. But in verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Now, I want you to stop and recognize something when it comes to overcoming fears. The fact of the matter is, if you were talking mano a mano, right, person to person, they are absolutely right in verse 31. They're absolutely right. The people they were going to have to go and conquer were, as a people, person to person, were stronger, bigger, faster, had more resources, were greater military powers. If you wanted to talk about it person to person, what they said in verse 31 is correct. Where they failed was they forgot that it wasn't themselves that was going to deliver the victory. Where the fear kicked in was they had forgotten that it was God who said, I'm going to give you that land. He didn't say, go determine whether you could take it or not. What God challenged them to do is go spy it out. Find out what kind of place it is that I'm going to deliver into your hands. And so they are technically accurate that the people of that land were stronger than them as a people. But where they were inaccurate is the fear of that convinced them to ignore what God had promised. And there are going to be days in our walk of faith where we're going to have to face that similar kind of challenge. Where we look at the obstacle in front of us and we say, this obstacle is bigger than I am, and it is. Or this circumstance is bigger than I am, and it is. And then we forget that, it is God who empowers us. It is God who strengthens us. It is God who walks with us, who gives us the courage and strength and fortitude to overcome the fears and do what is right. But they gave the children of Israel, verse 32, a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. See, that's all they could think about. Person to person. Forgot about their God. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. You cannot change the fact that you may appear or feel like a grasshopper in the midst of giants. And the only way to overcome the fear of that and what might concern us about our ability to overcome that is to remember the God who carries us. Don't be afraid of doing right, even when the obstacle seems bigger than me. Don't be afraid of doing what is right, even when the challenge may not be able to be overcome with my own personal strength. And where overcoming it will take the power and strength of the Creator. But don't let the fear convince me that it's not a worthy cause to strive to overcome it. Sometimes fear of failure. I'll delete this from the recording later, but I have ruined my oldest son. And in this way, I've ruined him because he took on my trait of this problem. I generally like to know that I'll be able to succeed at something before I ever start. It's just kind of the way I am for some reason. And I've tried over the years to overcome that. In some areas I have where I don't have the same kinds of trepidations about new things, but I just as soon do the tried and true. That's just kind of the way I am. I just feel more comfortable in areas where I've already seen success and therefore I don't have to worry about failure. And poor Sam learned that from me. And it's hindering sometimes, but especially spiritually speaking. Sometimes we can convince ourselves, well, I can't really be what God wants me to be, and I can't really be a faithful child of God. I've got too much of a past. I've got too many challenges. I'm too big of a sinner. And we go through the great big list of the reasons why I'm going to fail at it. And we never overcome those fears. Notice verse 24 of Matthew 25. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I know you knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid. What was he afraid of, by the way? Think about this with me for a minute. He was afraid, well, you might say, well, he's afraid of the master. Well, okay, why? Well, because the master's a hard man, and he reaps even where he doesn't sow, and he always seems to have success. And the 1 talent man felt if he lost the 1 talent, he would be a what? Failure. He convinced himself that if he lost the 1 talent that was given to him, that he would become a failure. And so, because he was afraid, he said, I hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. His fear of failure denied him growth. His fear of failure denied him some success. It's interesting. He said, the Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. At bare minimum, you should have at least put it in the bank and let me draw a little interest off of it and then come back. But fear. Friends, fear is crippling sometimes. It denies us the power and energy to go out and fulfill. I'm convinced from this parable that God, in the image here, would have preferred the 1 talent man try and failed and lose the 1 talent than to sit back and do nothing. Yeah, we're going to have moments of failure. We're going to step out of that boat like Peter did, and we're going to sink like a rock. But we still have to work to build faith and to honor God and to strive to do what is right. And recognize that, yes, failure is going to come from time to time, and we're not always going to be perfect, and we're not always going to do exactly what we should have. And there's going to be moments where we don't live up to what we had hoped for, but you cannot let that defeat you from the start. Because I can guarantee you one fact that you cannot and I cannot get away from. That to do nothing will certainly keep me from eternal life. Without question, to sit back and do nothing about my faith, and to do nothing about my relationship with God, and to bury my 1 talent in the ground will certainly put me into an eternal condemned state. And so put away the fears. And recognize that there may be some stumbling along the way. We're going to trip and fall, and there are going to be failures to have to be overcome. But you cannot and I cannot let that fear of failure keep me from doing that which is right in the eyes of God, because the alternative of burying my 1 talent in the ground is the same as if I had lost everything or failed completely. I have to try. I think about Felix in Acts chapter 24 and verse 24. In Acts chapter 24 and verse 24. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid. King James, I think, says, Felix trembled and answered, Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. You ever stop to think about, the text doesn't necessarily say what he was afraid of? You know, it's an interesting dynamic. If you add, go ahead and add just for a thought here, add verse 26 and 27. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. So when he heard about the gospel, he trembles, he's afraid, but he's not afraid of Paul in some senses because he's still asking for a bribe. They might be able to turn him loose. Finally, a new fella comes on the scene who's in charge. And wanting to do the Jews a favor, he leaves Paul bound. So obviously Paul didn't pay the bribe, he didn't get out. And he stays bound when the new ruler comes into play. But so what was he? What was his fear? Now, maybe, and I'm just going to give food for thought. You can think about it. You might say, well, he was afraid because he talked about self-control and judgment that is to come, and Felix recognized that he was a failure in those things. But a righteous fear of those things would have brought him to penitence and change. Maybe he's afraid if he responds to this gospel message that Paul was presented to him, he's no longer going to have the power and influence in the things that he had. I believe a man who is genuine. Now, maybe because what is he afraid? If he's really afraid of eternal condemnation, then you do something about it. But maybe his fear is more about what will the consequences be if I actually respond. Or the fear may be just as generic. A generic fear, well, yeah, that kind of scared me. And it makes me tremble to think of the circumstance I'm in, but it doesn't change me. And so maybe a secondary lesson, if we take that path for a minute, is that fear isn't necessarily a great educator. Because sometimes we can just push the fear away. He's afraid, maybe, of the judgment that is to come. It might have scared him to think that he's eternally lost for the moment. But he doesn't have any response or reaction to it. Whatever the fear is, he was able to either overcome it by saying, I'm not going to give in to Paul because that's going to put me in odds with these men. Or maybe he's saying to himself, I'm not giving in to Paul. I'm going to have to overcome these fears because I want to say, whatever his thinking is, fear didn't help him. You and I have got to be able to overcome fear. Felix overcame it to the negative. We need to overcome it to the positive. Men may say all kinds of things. Men may react in all kinds of ways. They may present all kinds of difficulties towards us. We have to determine, what am I really afraid of? What was Felix? Is he afraid of men? Is he afraid of God? Is he afraid of what his eternal condition is going to be? Is he afraid of what people might think of him if he becomes a Christian? What is he really afraid of? I don't know that we'll ever be able to definitively say that. At least I'm not. But here's what I do know. I've got to overcome my fears of serving God and doing what is right. I need to overcome the things that are hindering me and what makes me afraid and what makes me tremble in the eyes of men that might be keeping me away from a life of faith and conviction in relationship to Jehovah. So how can we encourage you in that this morning? How can we invite you to cast aside the fears and the concerns and say, I want to do what is right. I don't care what men think. I don't care what they have said. I don't care what they will do. I would rather put my hands in the God who has power over both body and soul than to give one validation to men who can only harm my earthly existence. What will my answer be to the things that have kept me away from serving God? If we could help you, strengthen you, encourage you to honor Him today, and we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.